The story of Richard Kuklinski begins far from the frozen legends that would later surround his name. Before he became known in whispered tones as the Iceman, before law enforcement would link him to a trail of cold-blooded murderers stretching across decades, he was simply a boy growing up in a brutal environment where violence was not an exception, it was routine. Richard was born into a working-class household where fear ruled the walls as surely as poverty. His father was a heavy-handed man, fueled by alcohol and anger, whose discipline crossed into cruelty with alarming regularity. His mother, deeply religious and emotionally distant, enforced punishment with equal severity, believing pain was a necessary tool for shaping obedience. In this house, there was no refuge, there was no softness. Love was conditional, and silence was survival. From an early age, Richard learned an important lesson, showing emotion invited punishment. Tears led to beings. Fear led to humiliation, so he learned to hide everything. He learned how to become invisible. That emotional withdrawal, that ability to shut down feelings, would later become one of his most dangerous traits. On the streets, things were no better. The neighborhoods of mid-20th century New Jersey were unforgiving places, especially for children who appeared weak. Richard adapted quickly. He learned how to fight, how to intimidate, and how to strike first. Violence became his language, and fear became his currency. Unlike other children, he did not lash out impulsively. He observed, he calculated, he waited. There were early warning signs, moments that in hindsight pointed towards something deeply unsettling. Richard showed an unusual comfort with cruelty. Where others recoiled, he remained calm. Where others felt guilt, he felt nothing. He later described feeling a strange sense of relief when inflicting pain, as if it gave him control in a world where he otherwise had none. As he grew older, his physical side became an advantage. Richard was a large, imposing figure, naturally intimidating even without effort. People noticed. Bullies backed down. Teachers avoided confrontation. Authority figures underestimated him, mistaking his quiet demeanor for obedience rather than restraint. By his teenage years, Richard had already crossed a psychological line. Violence was no longer reactive, it was deliberate. He had learned that intimidation worked, that fear opened doors, and that consequences could often be avoided if you stayed calm and said nothing. Silence became his shield. It was during this time that Richard began committing small crimes: theft, assault, extortion. These weren't acts of desperation, they were experiments. He was testing boundaries, measuring risk, and discovering how far he could go without being stopped. Each success reinforced a dangerous belief: he was smarter than everyone else. Unlike many criminals who crave attention or validation, Richard preferred anonymity. He didn't brag. He didn't boast. He didn't leave messages behind. What mattered to him was efficiency, control, completion. That mindset would later make him uniquely valuable to organized crime figures who needed problems solved quietly and permanently. As adulthood approached, Richard drifted naturally toward the criminal underworld, not because he admired it, but because it suited him. The rules were clear. Loyalty was transactional. Violence was expected, not questioned. For the first time, his emotional emptiness was not a liability, it was an asset. He took legitimate jobs during the day, blending into society with unsettling ease. Coworkers described him as polite, reserved, even friendly. No one suspected that beneath the calm exterior was a man capable of extreme brutality without hesitation or remorse. This dual life became one of his greatest strengths. What truly set Richard apart was his patience. He did not rush. He did not panic. When confronted with conflict, his heart rate barely changed. This calmness under pressure would later allow him to carry out acts that others could not stomach. To Richard, killing was not personal, it was procedural. As he moved deeper into the criminal world, word began to spread quietly, not through headlines or rumors, but through results. Problems disappeared. Debts were settled permanently. Enemies were silenced without drama. Richard Kuklinski was becoming something rare and dangerous, a man who could kill without emotion and live without suspicion. Yet at this stage, no one called him the Iceman. That name would come later. For now, he was simply a shadow present but unnoticed, powerful but underestimated. A man shaped by violence, refined by silence, and guided by a chilling absence of empathy. This was the foundation, the making of a killer who would later leave investigators stunned by the sheer scope of his crimes. A man whose calm voice and family man appearance would hide one of the darkest paths in American criminal history. And as Richard stepped fully into adulthood, The line between survival and choice disappeared. What followed would not be accidental. It would be intentional, cold, calculated, and irreversible. As adulthood settled in, Richard Kuklinski mastered something few criminals ever truly achieve: invisibility. He understood early that chaos attracts attention, and attention invites consequences. So he chose the opposite path. He built a life that looked ordinary, dependable, and unremarkable, while quietly nurturing a darker identity beneath the surface. Richard married, started a family, and moved into suburban neighborhoods where trimmed lawns and quiet streets gave the illusion of safety. He became the kind of man neighbors nodded at politely, a man who went to work, paid his bills, and returned home each evening without incident. To the outside world, he was a provider, a husband, a father. Nothing about him suggested danger, but this normalcy was carefully constructed. It was not accidental. Richard studied how people behaved, what they expected, and what made them comfortable. He learned that society often confuses silence with harmlessness. He used that misunderstanding to his advantage. By day, he worked legitimate jobs that placed him around people without arousing suspicion. He learned workplace routines, memorized schedules, and practiced appearing approachable. Co-workers described him as calm and soft-spoken. Some even called him gentle. That perception was critical. It allowed him to move freely, unnoticed and unquestioned. At home, he played his role convincingly. He attended family events, provided financially, and maintained strict control over his household. Beneath that control, however, was fear. His temper, when triggered, was explosive. His family lived within carefully defined boundaries, never quite knowing what might provoke his rage. To Richard, dominance was not about noise, it was about certainty. While his domestic life unfolded, his criminal activities expanded quietly. Richard gravitated toward individuals involved in organized crime, not through ambition, but through opportunity. He offered services others hesitated to provide. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not seek recognition. He simply delivered results. What made Richard particularly dangerous was his lack of emotional attachment to violence. For him, killing was not fueled by anger or revenge. It was transactional, a job to be done, a task to be completed efficiently. This mindset allowed him to plan carefully, choose locations strategically, and adapt methods without hesitation. He experimented relentlessly. He observed what worked and what didn't. Mistakes were unacceptable, so he eliminated variables wherever possible. He preferred controlled environments, predictable routines, and methods that left little trace. Each act sharpened his confidence, reinforcing the belief that he was untouchable. Unlike impulsive criminals who seek thrills, Richard sought control. He enjoyed knowing that someone's fate depended entirely on his decisions. That sense of power was quiet, internal, and deeply satisfying to him. There was no rush, only resolution. As his reputation spread through discreet channels, more work came his way. Each request followed the same unspoken understanding: discretion above all else. Richard became known as someone who would not talk, would not panic, and would not fail. In a world built on paranoia and betrayal, those qualities were priceless. He also learned how to compartmentalize with chilling precision. When he walked through his front door, the killer vanished. When he stepped away from family life, the other side emerged. There was no overlap in his mind, no guilt, no conflict. He viewed these roles as separate worlds governed by separate rules. This ability allowed him to live without visible strain. He slept soundly. He ate regularly. He laughed at appropriate moments. His emotional detachment acted like insulation, protecting him from the weight that crushes most people who commit violence. To Richard, memory held no burden. Money became a tool rather than a goal. He used it to reinforce his normal appearance: nice clothes, reliable vehicles, stable housing. Nothing flashy. Nothing that drew attention. He understood that excess invites curiosity, and curiosity is dangerous. Despite his growing involvement in serious crime, Richard avoided substances that impaired judgment. He valued clarity. Alcohol, drugs, and recklessness had no place in his routine. He treated his body like equipment, something that needed to function reliably under pressure. There were moments when people sensed something off about him. A coldness behind the eyes, a lack of empathy in his responses, but those impressions were fleeting. Most dismissed them as personality quirks. After all, monsters are supposed to look like monsters, and Richard did not. He followed news reports carefully, not out of fear, but out of interest. He studied law enforcement behavior, investigated patterns and public reactions. Each story offered lessons. Each mistake made by others reinforced his belief that he was different, smarter, more disciplined. As years passed, the separation between his two lives grew more extreme. The violence escalated in scope and confidence, yet his public persona remained unchanged. The contrast itself became his greatest protection. No one suspects the man who blends in perfectly. To Richard, this wasn't madness, it was balance. He believed he had found a way to exist without vulnerability, a way to move through the world untouched by its rules, a way to impose his will quietly, decisively, and without consequence. But the very traits that protected him were also shaping something dangerous. Confidence was hardening into arrogance. Control was becoming obsession, and the belief that he was invisible was slowly blinding him to risks he could not control forever. For now, though, Richard Kuklinski moved through his days unchallenged, an ordinary man in plain sight, carrying an extraordinary capacity for violence beneath a calm, frozen surface. And the ice around him was only getting thicker. By the time Richard Kuklinski fully stepped into the role of a professional killer, he had already made a crucial realization. Violence alone was not enough. Anyone could pull a trigger or throw a punch, but survival in the long term required something else entirely: discipline, innovation, and an obsession with eliminating evidence. Richard approached killing the way a craftsman approaches his trade. Each job was an opportunity to refine technique, reduce risk, and perfect execution. He understood that law enforcement did not catch killers because they were violent. They caught them because they were careless. Carelessness, to Richard, was a personal failure. He began by studying patterns, how bodies were discovered, how investigations unfolded, and how mistakes were made. He paid attention to timelines, witness behavior, and environmental factors. Every detail mattered. He was especially interested in how time altered evidence, how decomposition confused investigators, and how distance complicated connection. Unlike impulsive criminals, Richard planned far in advance. He memorized routes, studied locations, and prepared multiple contingencies. If one plan failed, another was already in place. He never relied on luck. Luck was unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. One of his defining traits was patience. He was willing to wait days, sometimes weeks, for the right moment. He did not rush encounters. He allowed targets to fall into predictable routines before acting. This patience minimized surprises and maximized control. Richard also experimented with methods. He did not settle on a single approach. Instead, he adapted based on circumstance. He believed repetition created patterns, and patterns created trails. Variety, on the other hand, created confusion. Confusion bought time. He understood the psychological side of killing as well. Fear, he learned, caused people to behave irrationally. Panic led to noise, mistakes, and attention. So he avoided creating fear until the last possible moment. Many never had time to react at all. To Richard, efficiency meant minimizing struggle. What set him apart most was his emotional neutrality. There was no adrenaline spike, no hesitation. His pulse remained steady even in moments others would find unbearable. This calm allowed him to notice small details: a sound out of place, a shadow moving, a door not fully closed. These observations often made the difference between success and disaster. Richard also learned how to dispose of what remained. He understood that bodies told stories. They revealed timing, cause, and sometimes identity. His goal was to silence those stories completely. He studied environmental effects, temperature, and isolation. Nature, he discovered, could be a powerful ally when used correctly. He paid attention to how people vanished. Missing persons were often treated differently than murder victims. Without a body, investigations stalled. Resources dwindled. Time passed. Richard learned to exploit that gap. He understood that absence was often more effective than spectacle. As his confidence grew, so did his willingness to take on more complex tasks. These were not crimes of passion. They were assignments that required precision and discretion. He accepted them without emotion, viewing each one as another problem to solve. Money was exchanged quietly. There were no contracts, no receipts, no written agreements. Everything was verbal. Everything was temporary. Richard trusted his memory and expected the same from others. Those who talked did not last long. Despite the brutality of his actions, Richard maintained strict personal rules. He avoided unnecessary exposure. He never spoke about his work, even indirectly. He did not confide in friends or associates. Silence was absolute. Words he believed were the most dangerous evidence of all. He also understood that overconfidence killed. So he constantly adjusted. If a method felt too comfortable, he abandoned it. If a location became familiar, he avoided it. Comfort bred mistakes, and mistakes ended careers. At the same time, he refined his public image even further. He dressed conservatively, he spoke politely. He avoided conflict in public spaces. The contrast between his demeanor and his actions grew more extreme, and that contrast protected him. People remember extremes, but rarely suspect them. There were moments when his path crossed close to danger. Unexpected interruptions, close calls, near exposure. But each time his composure carried him through. Panic never surfaced. He adapted in real time, adjusting without visible stress. To observers, he appeared unremarkable, even forgettable. Richard's ability to detach allowed him to rationalize everything. He did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as effective. In his mind, responsibility lay with those who ordered the acts, not the one who carried them out. This belief insulated him from moral conflict and reinforced his self-image as a professional rather than a monster. As time passed, his methods became more refined, his confidence more entrenched. He began to believe that he had solved the problem of consequence, that he had discovered a way to operate beyond accountability, that he was immune to the systems designed to stop men like him. But beneath that confidence was a growing pattern, one even he could not fully see. Each successful act reinforced his sense of superiority. Each escape from suspicion strengthened his belief that he was untouchable. That belief, slowly and quietly, was shaping decisions that would one day matter more than technique. For now, though, Richard Kuklinski continued his work unseen, a silent figure moving through shadows, a man who believed he had mastered not just killing, but disappearance itself. And in his world, disappearing was the ultimate form of control. As the years passed, Richard Kuklinski began to understand that killing itself was only part of the equation. Violence created fear, but fear alone did not build stability. What truly mattered was leverage, money, influence, and the ability to control outcomes without raising suspicion. This realization marked a shift in how he viewed his place in the criminal world. Richard no longer saw himself as a tool used by others. He saw himself as an independent force, someone who could choose when to act, how to act, and for whom. This sense of autonomy was intoxicating. It reinforced his belief that he was no longer reacting to circumstances, he was shaping them. Money flowed steadily now, but it was never flashy. Richard avoided extravagance with discipline. He understood that sudden wealth drew attention, and attention was dangerous. Instead, he used money strategically. He paid debt promptly. He invested quietly. He ensured his household never lacked anything while appearing comfortably middle class. Behind this financial stability was a deeper motive. Money represented proof of competence. Each payment validated his efficiency and reliability. In a world where trust was rare, being dependable was power, people came back to him not because he was feared, but because he delivered exactly what was promised. Richard also learned how to manipulate perception. He noticed that criminals, much like ordinary people, wanted reassurance. They wanted to believe their problems were handled by someone capable. He offered that reassurance without boasting. His calm voice, his measured responses, and his refusal to dramatize violence made others feel secure. This emotional steadiness set him apart. While others bragged, threatened, or exaggerated, Richard remained quiet. That silence created mystique. People filled the gaps themselves, often imagining more than he ever revealed. Fear rooted in imagination was more effective than fear built on stories. At the same time, his personal life grew more rigid. Control became increasingly important. He expected obedience, order, and predictability within his household. Any challenge to his authority triggered anger that was swift and overwhelming. To Richard, defiance was not disagreement, it was a threat to stability. Despite this volatility at home, he maintained a convincing public image. He attended gatherings, spoke politely, and blended seamlessly into social environments. He learned how to mirror emotions without actually feeling them. Laughter, concern, friendliness all performed with precision. What few understood was that Richard viewed relationships as systems. Each person served a purpose. Loyalty was not emotional, it was functional. As long as someone fulfilled their role, they were tolerated. When they failed, they became a liability. This mindset extended into his criminal dealings. He avoided emotional attachment to associates. He kept interactions brief and impersonal. He believed familiarity bred weakness, and weakness led to mistakes. Distance, on the other hand, preserved clarity. As his confidence grew, so did his appetite for control. He began taking on jobs not just for money, but for dominance. Proving capability became as important as compensation. Each successful outcome reinforced his internal narrative that he was operating above everyone else. He paid close attention to how fear moved through criminal networks. One decisive act could alter behavior across an entire group. People became cautious. Conversations changed. Decisions slowed. Richard understood that violence, when applied selectively, reshaped entire environments. This understanding gave him a sense of authorship over events. He no longer felt like a participant in crime, he felt like an architect, someone who could shift outcomes quietly without being seen. But this growing sense of control also carried risk. The more power Richard believed he held, the more he tested boundaries. He began trusting his instincts over caution. He took calculated risks that he would not have considered earlier. Each time he escaped consequence, his belief in his own invulnerability hardened. At the same time, he remained deeply observant. He noticed subtle changes in behavior, hesitations, nervous glances, inconsistencies. He trusted these instincts and acted preemptively when something felt off. To him, suspicion was reason enough. This hypervigilance kept him alive, but it also isolated him further. Trust became impossible. Even those who relied on him were kept at arm's length. Richard preferred solitude to uncertainty. In silence he felt safest. Despite his control, cracks existed beneath the surface. Maintaining multiple identities required constant discipline. One mistake, a careless word, an emotional outburst, an impulsive decision could unravel everything. Richard knew this, yet believed his self-control was absolute. He convinced himself that rules applied to others, not to him, that he understood the system better than those tasked with enforcing it. That preparation alone could defeat chance. This belief shaped every choice he made. He pushed forward, expanding his influence quietly, reinforcing his position with each calculated move. He believed he had achieved the perfect balance: power without exposure, violence without consequence. But balance once achieved is fragile, and the very confidence that sustained Richard's control was slowly setting the stage for pressures he could not fully predict. For now, though, he moved forward without hesitation. A man who believed he had mastered fear, money, and silence. A man convinced that control, once earned, could never be taken away. And in that belief, the ice around him grew thicker, harder, heavier, and far more dangerous. By this stage of his life, Richard Kuklinski no longer experienced violence as something extraordinary. What once required planning, preparation, and mental focus had gradually become routine. The act itself had lost its weight. What remained was procedure, steps to follow, risks to manage, outcomes to secure. This normalization was perhaps the most dangerous shift of all. Richard no longer marked moments emotionally. There were no internal signals telling him when he had crossed another moral line, because those lines no longer existed. Killing was no longer an event, it was a function, something that happened between other parts of his day, like commuting or eating dinner. This routine allowed him to operate with unsettling efficiency. He scheduled his actions carefully, fitting them into his life without disruption. To the outside world, nothing changed. He still appeared reliable, predictable, and ordinary. That consistency became his camouflage. What changed internally was subtler. His patience shortened. His tolerance for inconvenience faded. When obstacles appeared, he dealt with them decisively. He no longer viewed problems as temporary. To Richard, unresolved issues were threats waiting to grow. As a result, violence became his default solution, not out of anger, but out of preference. It was clean, final, and effective. Negotiation required trust. Violence required none. He began to believe that most people were liabilities by nature. They talked too much. They made emotional decisions. They hesitated when clarity was required. In his mind, these flaws justified their removal. He saw himself not as cruel, but as practical. This mindset extended into his everyday interactions. He became increasingly dismissive of others' concerns. Empathy, already minimal, faded further. He did not see people as individuals with inner lives, but as variables within systems, useful or obstructive. Nothing more. At home, this emotional detachment intensified tension. He demanded order and obedience, viewing chaos as disrespect. Any challenge to his authority felt intolerable. His anger surfaced quickly, then disappeared just as fast, leaving fear in its wake. To him, fear was not a problem, it was proof of control. Despite this volatility, he remained methodical. He never acted impulsively in public. He never allowed emotions to override strategy outside his private space. This separation was deliberate. Public composure was survival. Richard also refined his ability to read people. He paid close attention to micro-expressions, pauses, changes in tone. These details told him more than words ever could. When someone hesitated too long or asked the wrong question, he noticed. Suspicion became a constant companion. He trusted no one fully. Trust implied vulnerability, and vulnerability implied risk. Even those who relied on him were observed closely. He kept mental lists who talked too much, who hesitated, who seemed nervous. This constant evaluation reinforced his isolation. There were no real connections, only functional relationships. Richard preferred it that way. Emotional distance protected him from unpredictability. As violence became routine, the methods grew colder. Efficiency replaced intensity. He sought approaches that minimized effort and maximized certainty. The goal was no longer dominance, it was erasure. Removing a person completely, as if they had never existed. This desire for erasure extended beyond physical outcomes. He wanted no emotional residue, no lingering thoughts, no memories that interfered with sleep. To achieve this, he compartmentalized more aggressively than ever. Each act was sealed away mentally, never revisited. Sleep came easily to him. His mind did not replay scenes or question decisions. This absence of inner conflict reinforced his belief that he was built differently, that something essential was missing, and that missing piece was his greatest strength. He also grew more confident in managing risk. Near misses no longer unsettled him. Instead, they validated his adaptability. Each close call became proof of his superiority over systems designed to catch people like him. This confidence bordered on inevitability. Richard began to believe that as long as he followed his internal rules, nothing could touch him. Preparation, silence, and discipline formed a shield he trusted completely. But routine carries its own dangers. Familiarity dulls caution. Repetition creates patterns, even when variety is intended. Richard believed he was immune to this, yet subtle habits were forming preferences, tendencies, unconscious rhythms. He did not notice them. He trusted his judgment too much to question it. At the same time, his emotional detachment deepened into something closer to emptiness. There was no joy, only satisfaction, no excitement, only completion. Life became a sequence of tasks, each one checked off and forgotten. This internal void did not bother him. In fact, he preferred it. Emotion complicated things. Emotion weakened resolve. In emptiness, he found clarity. To those around him, he appeared stable, predictable, reliable. No one saw the internal erosion taking place. No one noticed that the line between necessity and choice had disappeared entirely. Violence was no longer a means to an end. It was simply part of how Richard navigated the world. And in treating it as routine, he crossed into a state where restraint relied entirely on his own judgment, without external limits, without internal resistance, and without pause. That self-contained system worked perfectly until the world outside it began to shift in ways he did not fully control. For now, though, Richard Kuklinski continued forward, steady, silent, and convinced that routine had made him untouchable. But routine, like ice, can crack without warning. As time moved forward, Richard Kuklinski remained convinced that discipline alone could preserve his carefully constructed world. He trusted routine, silence, and preparation more than any external protection. Yet beneath that confidence, subtle pressures were building, quiet shifts that signaled change, even if he refused to acknowledge them. The criminal environment around him was evolving. People were becoming more careless, more talkative, more impulsive. Richard noticed it immediately. He saw recklessness where there had once been caution. greed where there had once been restraint. This disturbed him. Chaos threatened control, and control was the foundation of everything he relied on. He responded by tightening his rules. Interactions became shorter, meetings became rarer. He reduced exposure wherever possible, choosing isolation over risk. To him, solitude was not loneliness, it was safety. At the same time, pressure at home intensified. Maintaining authority required constant enforcement. He viewed any deviation from expectation as instability. His reactions grew sharper, less measured. While he believed he was restoring order, he was actually amplifying fear. This imbalance began to drain him in ways he did not fully recognize. Not emotionally, he did not experience fatigue the way others did, but mentally. The constant vigilance, the endless calculations, the perpetual readiness to act were taking a toll. Still, he pressed on. Richard prided himself on being adaptable. When patterns shifted, he adjusted. When risks increased, he compensated. But adaptability depends on accurate information, and that information was becoming harder to trust. Too many variables were beyond his control now: other people's mistakes, law enforcement changes, unpredictable behaviors. He began to sense scrutiny. Not directly, not openly, but in subtle ways. Conversations felt different. Questions lingered too long. Certain individuals seemed hesitant in ways he could not immediately explain. These signals unsettled him not because he felt fear, but because uncertainty violated his sense of order. In response, he relied more heavily on instinct. His instincts had served him well for years. They had warned him before danger appeared. But instinct, when unchecked, can blur into assumption. And assumptions, no matter how confident, can be flawed. He also noticed a change within himself. His tolerance for imperfection had vanished. Minor inconveniences triggered disproportionate responses. Delays felt like threats. Hesitation felt like betrayal. His worldview had narrowed to absolutes: control or chaos, obedience or removal. This rigidity made him efficient, but it also reduced flexibility. He became less willing to reassess decisions once made. To Richard, reconsideration felt like weakness. As external pressure grew, he doubled down on secrecy. He trusted fewer people than ever before. He kept information compartmentalized so tightly that even functional cooperation became strained. While this reduced risk of betrayal, it also limited support. He was operating alone, by design. This isolation reinforced a dangerous belief that only he could manage outcomes correctly, that others inevitably introduced error, that systems failed because they depended on people. In some ways, this belief was accurate. In others, it blinded him. He continued his activities with the same outward calm, but internally his calculations grew more complex. Each action required more justification, more preparation, more contingency planning. What once felt controlled now felt precarious, even if he refused to name it as such. He studied news reports more closely than ever, not with curiosity, but with analysis. He watched how investigations evolved, how tactics changed, how technology crept quietly into processes that had once relied on human error. These developments unsettled him. Technology did not panic. It did not forget. It did not hesitate. Richard understood this, yet believed he could outthink it. He trusted his experience over innovation. He believed that human judgment would always remain the weak link, and that he knew how to exploit it. At home, his emotional distance widened further. Communication became directive rather than conversational. Affection, already scarce, vanished almost entirely. To him, these were distractions. Focus mattered more than comfort. Yet this detachment created unpredictability within his own walls. Fear breeds compliance, but it also breeds mistakes. Small actions, misunderstandings, or emotional reactions could ripple outward in ways he could not fully control. Still, Richard maintained his routine. Routine was his anchor. As long as each day followed expected patterns, he believed stability would hold. But stability based entirely on control is fragile. It requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant pressure. And pressure, when sustained long enough, reveals weaknesses even in systems designed to suppress them. Richard Kuklinski did not believe he was cracking. He believed he was adapting. He told himself that increased caution meant increased strength, that narrowing his world meant securing it. Yet beneath the surface, the ice was no longer smooth. Stress fractures had begun to form quiet, invisible lines spreading slowly outward. For now they held. He continued forward with the same measured steps, convinced that discipline would carry him through any challenge, convinced that silence would protect him, convinced that control once earned could never be taken away. But control is not permanent. It must be renewed constantly, and as the pressure continued to build, the cracks beneath the ice deepened, waiting for the moment when weight, timing, and circumstance would finally align. By this point in his life, Richard Kuklinski had reached a dangerous conclusion. Trust was not merely risky, it was unnecessary. For years, he had proven to himself that independence was safer than reliance. The fewer people involved, the fewer variables existed, and yet, no matter how disciplined a man was, complete isolation was impossible. Every operation, every exchange, every quiet transaction required at least one other human being. And human beings, in Richard's view, were inherently flawed. He approached interactions with calculated restraint. Conversations were minimal. Details were limited. Information was shared only on a need-to-know basis, and even then, filtered carefully. Richard believed that words were liabilities. Once spoken, they existed beyond control. Despite this caution, subtle shifts were occurring in the world around him. Criminal networks were changing. Loyalty was thinning. People were becoming impatient, driven by short-term gains rather than long-term survival. Richard watched these changes with increasing irritation. He believed most people lacked discipline. They talked too much, spent too freely, and underestimated consequences. In his mind, these weaknesses justified his distance, yet that same distance made it harder for him to accurately assess others' intentions. Trust, he discovered, did not fail loudly. It failed quietly. He began noticing small inconsistency, stories that didn't align perfectly, reactions that arrived a moment too late, expressions that lingered just long enough to suggest calculation. None of it was definitive. But Richard trusted patterns, and patterns were beginning to emerge. In response, he tested people subtly. He changed plans at the last minute. He withheld information to see who asked questions. He observed reactions carefully, storing each detail away. Those who adapted quickly earned temporary tolerance. Those who hesitated were marked mentally. These tests were not emotional, they were diagnostic. At the same time, Richard's sense of superiority hardened. He believed he saw the world more clearly than others. Where they saw opportunity, he saw risk. Where they felt excitement, he felt caution. This belief reinforced his isolation and justified his lack of empathy. He viewed betrayal not as a possibility, but as an inevitability delayed by circumstance. In his mind, everyone would fail eventually. The only question was when. This expectation shaped his behavior. He never fully relaxed. He never allowed familiarity to soften vigilance. Even moments of apparent calm were used for observation. Silence, to Richard, was never empty, it was informative. Yet this constant suspicion carried a cost. When every interaction is a potential threat, clarity becomes harder to maintain. He began interpreting neutral behavior as suspicious. Ambiguity became danger. The line between caution and paranoia grew thin. Still, he trusted himself. He believed his instincts were sharper than reason, that his experience outweighed doubt. When something felt wrong, that feeling was enough. As his world narrowed, his reliance on routine intensified. Predictability gave him control. Each deviation felt destabilizing. He responded by enforcing structure more aggressively, both in his personal life and in his criminal dealings. But structure depends on cooperation, and cooperation depends at least minimally on trust. This contradiction frustrated him. He wanted control without dependence, certainty without vulnerability. It was an impossible balance, yet he pursued it relentlessly. The more he pushed others away, the more pressure he placed on himself. Every decision, every contingency, every outcome rested entirely on his judgment. There was no one to share responsibility with, no one to absorb error. This self-imposed burden did not slow him down, but it narrowed his margin for mistake. At the same time, the environment around him grew more complex. Law enforcement methods evolved quietly. Surveillance became more sophisticated. Coordination improved. These changes were subtle, but Richard sensed them. He responded by becoming even more careful, even more controlled. Yet control has limits, especially when it relies solely on one mind. He began to revisit decisions more frequently, not out of doubt, but out of necessity. Each plan required more refinement than the last. What once felt simple now demanded layers of precaution. Despite this, he remained outwardly calm. No one saw strain on his face or heard it in his voice. His composure was absolute. If pressure existed, it stayed internal, but internal pressure accumulates. Richard also noticed changes in himself. His patience with inefficiency was gone. He no longer tolerated delays or misunderstandings. When something went wrong, his response was immediate and severe. To him, decisiveness was survival. Yet decisiveness without reflection can become rigidity. And rigidity in a shifting world can be dangerous. Trust, he believed, was the first mistake anyone made, and so he trusted no one. But in doing so, he ignored a different truth: that isolation limits perspective, that even the most disciplined mind benefits from external calibration. Richard Kuklinski did not believe this. He believed that dependence weakened judgment, that solitude sharpened it, and so he continued forward alone, surrounded by people yet connected to none. A man convinced that betrayal was everywhere, and that vigilance alone could prevent it. For now, that belief held. But the longer trust is denied, the more fragile control becomes, because eventually, every system, no matter how disciplined, faces a test it cannot manage alone. Silence had always been Richard Kuklinski's greatest weapon. It protected him, concealed him, and allowed him to move through life without leaving obvious traces. But as time passed, silence began to take on a different quality. It was no longer just a shield, it became a weight. Richard lived in a world where words were dangerous. Every sentence spoken carried potential consequence. Every explanation invited scrutiny. So he reduced communication to the bare minimum. Statements were brief. Answers were controlled. Emotions were withheld. To most people, this made him appear calm and disciplined. To Richard, it was survival. Yet silence demands constant effort. It requires vigilance, restraint, and a steady suppression of impulse. Richard managed this well, but the effort was unending. There were no moments of release, no spaces where he could let his guard down completely. He filled that silence with routine. Predictable patterns gave him structure. Each day followed a familiar rhythm: work, movement, interaction, withdrawal. The repetition reassured him. As long as the pattern held, control remained intact. But patterns, once established, also become visible. Richard understood this risk, even if he refused to dwell on it. He adjusted details, frequently timing routes, habits, believing small changes were enough to disrupt observation. Still, the broader structure remained. The longer he lived this way, the more isolated he became. Conversations around him grew shallow. Relationships became functional. There was no space for vulnerability, and he would not have allowed it even if there were. In moments of quiet, rare, unoccupied moments, he sometimes sensed the emptiness beneath his discipline. Not sadness, not regret, but absence. A lack of connection that had grown so familiar it barely registered. He did not question this absence. Questions led to reflection, and reflection led to distraction. Distraction was dangerous. Instead, he focused outward. He listened more than he spoke. He observed how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. These observations reinforced his worldview. People were careless. They revealed themselves constantly through small actions and idle words. Richard found reassurance in this. It confirmed his belief that silence was strength. Still, silence also limited him. Without open communication, misunderstandings accumulated. Signals became harder to interpret. Intentions blurred. He compensated by relying more heavily on intuition. His intuition had been sharpened by years of observation. But intuition is shaped by perspective, and his perspective had narrowed. As his world constricted, the outside world continued to change. He noticed it in subtle ways. People spoke differently. Technology crept quietly into daily life. Information moved faster, traveled farther. Secrets were harder to contain. These changes unsettled him, even if he refused to acknowledge the feeling. He preferred environments he understood completely, familiar systems, predictable behaviors. He responded by tightening control further. He reduced unnecessary movement. He avoided unfamiliar settings. He kept interactions brief and purposeful. This strategy preserved safety, but it also increased isolation. His life became smaller, more contained. He operated within a shrinking circle of familiarity, convinced that anything beyond it carried unnecessary risk. At home, silence took on another form. Conversations were limited, often directive. Emotional expression was discouraged. Richard believed this prevented disorder. In reality, it created distance that could not be bridged easily. But distance did not concern him. He valued order over closeness, predictability over warmth. He justified this approach logically. Emotion led to mistakes. Attachment created vulnerability. Silence preserved control, yet control is not the same as stability. Control requires constant enforcement. Stability, once achieved, sustains itself. Richard confused the two. As time passed, maintaining silence required more effort than before. He found himself rehearsing responses mentally, anticipating questions, calculating the safest phrasing. These mental exercises were automatic, but they consumed attention. Attention that could not be spent elsewhere. He compensated by simplifying decisions. When options appeared, he chose the path that minimized exposure, even if it reduced flexibility. When faced with uncertainty, he defaulted to avoidance. Avoidance kept him safe, but it also limited his awareness. He no longer sought new information actively. He relied on what he already knew. Experience, he believed, was superior to adaptation. This belief hardened into habit. Despite everything, Richard remained composed. No cracks appeared on the surface. His demeanor was steady, his voice calm, his movements controlled. Anyone observing him would see nothing unusual. But silence amplifies internal pressure. Without release, without expression, thoughts circulate endlessly. Richard did not experience this as anxiety. He experienced it as focus. Yet even focus has limits. As his world grew quieter, external signals became more important and more difficult to interpret accurately. A delayed response, a missed call, an unexpected question, each one carried disproportionate weight. He analyzed these moments carefully, searching for meaning. Sometimes meaning existed. Sometimes it did not. Distinguishing between the two grew harder. Silence, once a tool, was becoming an environment. Richard Kuklinski believed he had mastered that environment. He believed that as long as he said little and revealed nothing, he remained untouchable. For now, that belief held. But silence does not erase reality. It only delays confrontation. And as the quiet stretched on, its weight continued to grow, pressing inward, compressing perspective, and preparing the ground for forces that could not be held back forever. By now, Richard Kuklinski had settled into a belief that defined every decision he made. He was beyond reach, not because he was reckless, but because he was careful. Not because he was lucky, but because he was disciplined. In his mind, the world was divided into those who made mistakes and those who did not, and he placed himself firmly in the second category. This belief did not arrive suddenly. It formed slowly, reinforced by years of moving through danger without consequence. Each successful outcome strengthened the idea that he understood the system better than anyone else. He had seen others fall. He had watched arrogance, impatience, and carelessness destroy them. He believed he had learned from their failures. What he did not see was how success itself reshapes perception. Richard no longer evaluated risk the way he once had, not because he ignored it, but because he trusted his ability to manage it absolutely. Where uncertainty appeared, he assumed it could be neutralized. Where complexity increased, he believed he could simplify it through control. This confidence affected how he moved through the world. His posture remained calm, his voice steady, his decisions decisive. Doubt did not surface, not because it did not exist, but because he had trained himself to suppress it instantly. He interpreted caution from others as weakness. Hesitation signaled incompetence. In his view, decisive action separated survivors from casualties. That mindset served him well until it narrowed his perspective too far. As his sense of invulnerability grew, his tolerance for unpredictability vanished. When events did not unfold as expected, his response was immediate and corrective. He adjusted quickly, but always from the assumption that he was in control. This assumption influenced how he interpreted warning signs. Subtle shifts in behavior that once might have prompted deeper analysis were now dismissed as noise. He believed he had seen everything before. That experience covered all possibilities. Experience, however, is shaped by past conditions, and conditions were changing. The world around him was becoming less forgiving of silence. Information traveled faster. Connections formed invisibly. Patterns emerged where none had been noticed before. Richard sensed these changes vaguely, but believed his methods transcended them. He trusted his routines. He trusted his judgment. He trusted the persona he had crafted over decades. Trust, in this context, became complacency. At the same time, he grew more assertive in enforcing boundaries. When someone questioned him, even subtly, his patience evaporated. To Richard, questioning implied threat. Threats required resolution. He did not see this as escalation. He saw it as maintenance. Preserving order required constant correction. This rigidity began to shape his decisions in quiet ways. He chose certainty over flexibility, control over adaptability, familiar solutions over innovative ones. These choices felt safe, but safety built on repetition creates patterns. Richard believed patterns were for others. He believed his variation was sufficient to disrupt observation. What he underestimated was the cumulative effect of behavior over time. In his private life, the illusion of being untouchable manifested differently. He dismissed concerns. He ignored warnings. He believed consequences existed for other people, not for him. This attitude reinforced distance and fear within his household, but he interpreted that fear as respect. Respect, he believed, ensured order. Yet fear does not prevent observation. It encourages it. As pressure mounted subtly from multiple directions, Richard responded not by slowing down, but by tightening control further. He reduced margin for error by reducing tolerance for uncertainty. Everything had to be exact. This approach made him efficient but also predictable in its intensity. His reactions followed consistent logic. To him, consistency was strength. To an outside observer, consistency could be mapped. Still, Richard felt no anxiety. Anxiety required anticipation of loss, and he did not believe loss applied to him. He had outmaneuvered systems too many times to doubt himself now. In moments of reflection rare and fleeting, he sometimes acknowledged the possibility of exposure, but he dismissed it quickly. Preparation, he believed, had already accounted for that scenario. He trusted the distance he maintained, the silence, the discipline. These had carried him this far. What he failed to recognize was that invulnerability is not as stated as a perception, and perceptions, no matter how deeply held, do not alter reality. The more he believed he was untouchable, the less he questioned assumptions. The less he questioned assumptions, the more fragile his control became. Yet, from his perspective, nothing was wrong. Each day unfolded as expected. Each interaction followed familiar patterns. No alarms sounded. No confrontations erupted. Life continued. This apparent normalcy reinforced his belief that he had mastered not only violence, but consequence itself. Richard Kuklinski moved forward with quiet certainty, convinced that his discipline had placed him beyond accountability. He believed the world operated on rules he had already solved. But systems do not announce failure in advance. They accumulate pressure silently, adjusting invisibly, until one moment reveals everything at once. For now, Richard walked unchallenged, secure in the illusion that nothing could reach him, and illusions, once fully believed, are the hardest to abandon, especially when the truth arrives without warning. There came a time when Richard Kuklinski began to notice that the world around him no longer felt as wide as it once had. Streets that used to seem anonymous now felt narrower. Familiar places carried a faint sense of pressure, as though unseen forces were slowly drawing closer. Nothing obvious had changed, but something had shifted. Richard did not interpret this as danger. He interpreted it as inconvenience. He believed pressure was a natural byproduct of success. The more effectively one operated, the more resistance emerged. To him, this was proof of importance, not vulnerability. He responded the way he always had, by tightening control and minimizing exposure. His movements became more deliberate. He limited unnecessary travel. He avoided unfamiliar environments. Each decision was weighed carefully, filtered through years of experience. He trusted this process absolutely. Yet experience, while powerful, can also become a trap. It anchors decision-making to what has worked before, even when conditions evolve. Richard continued to rely on patterns that had protected him for decades. He believed those patterns were invisible. He believed they blended seamlessly into the noise of everyday life. But repetition, even subtle repetition, accumulates weight over time. He noticed more delays than before. Conversations that ended too abruptly, responses that arrived with hesitation. These moments registered in his mind, not as alarms, but as irritations. People were becoming less efficient, less reliable. Efficiency mattered to Richard. It was the measure by which he judged competence. When efficiency declined around him, he assumed incompetence was to blame. This assumption shaped his reactions. He became more controlling, more exacting. Instructions were clearer, boundaries firmer. He expected compliance without explanation. To him, clarity eliminated confusion. But clarity delivered without trust often produces fear, and fear produces mistakes. Richard sensed these mistakes. He saw tension in others' behavior. He observed discomfort in their posture, their timing, their tone. Instead of questioning whether his presence caused that tension, he interpreted it as weakness. Weakness, in his worldview, was unacceptable. He compensated by withdrawing further. Silence increased, contact narrowed. He believed that distance would stabilize the situation. Less interaction meant fewer opportunities for error. This strategy worked temporarily. Meanwhile, the environment beyond his immediate awareness continued to change. Processes became more interconnected. Information flowed in ways he could not see directly. He understood this intellectually, but underestimated its practical impact. He believed human error would always undermine systems. That belief had been correct for a long time. But systems were evolving to rely less on individual memory and more on cumulative data. Richard did not panic over this. Panic was useless. Instead, he trusted his adaptability. He told himself that if circumstances changed, he would adjust. What he did not consider was that adjustment requires awareness, and awareness depends on accurate feedback. As his isolation increased, feedback diminished. In his personal life, tension continued to rise. Control replaced communication almost entirely. Emotional distance hardened into silence. To Richard, this was order. To others, it was unpredictability. Unpredictability breeds observation. Still, he felt composed. He slept without interruption. His appetite remained steady. There were no physical signs of stress. His body responded the way it always had: calm, controlled, prepared. This reinforced his belief that everything was under control. Stress, he believed, was a sign of weakness. Since he felt none, he assumed none existed. But pressure does not always announce itself through discomfort. Sometimes it operates quietly, accumulating in the background. Richard began simplifying decisions even further. When faced with ambiguity, he chose the option that reduced exposure, even if it reduced opportunity. This cautious conservatism felt safe, yet excessive caution can also signal vulnerability. When behavior shifts subtly, patterns emerge. He did not notice these patterns forming. He believed his changes were too minor, too calculated, too disciplined to be detected. Confidence shielded him from doubt. Still, small disruptions continued. Nothing dramatic, nothing undeniable. Just enough to register, not enough to confront directly. Richard interpreted these moments as tests, challenges meant to measure his resolve. He responded by doubling down on discipline. Discipline had always saved him. It had carried him through uncertainty, conflict, and chaos. He trusted it more than instinct now. But discipline without flexibility becomes rigidity. And rigidity struggles in dynamic environments. As days passed, the sense of pressure did not disappear. It remained faint, but persistent, like a distant sound that never quite fades. Richard acknowledged it without naming it. Naming it would give it power. Instead, he focused on execution. Tasks were completed efficiently. Interactions remained controlled. Nothing outwardly suggested instability. Yet beneath that surface, the margin for error was shrinking. Every decision carried more weight than before. Every action required more precision. Richard Kuklinski believed this meant he was approaching perfection. In reality, it meant the system surrounding him was tightening slowly, silently, methodically. For now, he remained free, confident, and composed. The world had not confronted him directly. No doors had closed. No voices had accused. And so he continued forward, trusting the methods that had always protected him, unaware that when the world truly begins to close in, it rarely does so loudly. It closes quietly. By now, Richard Kuklinski had developed a deep awareness of the duality in his life: the world outside and the world within. The outside world, with its transactions, threats, and movements, could be mapped, predicted, and manipulated. The world within, however, was something he rarely examined. Silence had allowed him freedom, but it had also hidden subtle truths. The shadows within were not chaotic. They were controlled yet persistent. They were reminders of what even discipline could not entirely suppress. Richard's daily routine was meticulous. He moved through time with precision, measuring hours and activities that ensured no exposure, no attention, no trace. He remained the calm, steady figure that others had come to trust and fear in equal measure. Every action had purpose. Every step had calculation. The world around him believed in his composure and his reliability, in the quiet efficiency he exuded. And yet inwardly there were moments that escaped the neat edges of his planning. Even for someone who prided himself on neutrality and detachment, the human mind resists total compartmentalization. Occasionally Richard noticed small fissures in the self-imposed armor. Memories of events, faces, names, locations would resurface unbidden. Not as guilt, not as regret, but as patterns too vivid to ignore. They reminded him that the world he navigated successfully was built on acts irreversible and absolute. The permanence of his actions contrasted sharply with the impermanence of life itself, creating a quiet tension that he could neither ignore nor fully confront. He recognized the danger in reflection. It had the power to weaken judgment, to introduce hesitation. He avoided dwelling on these moments, quickly redirecting his focus to immediate tasks. Observation became a refuge. He watched people, listened to tones, detected the slightest shifts in behavior. These practices reinforced control, reaffirmed discipline, and anchored him against the potential distraction of introspection. Yet the shadows within were persistent. They whispered in silent moments, unspooling sequences of choices and outcomes that he had yet to anticipate. Even with years of careful calculation, there remained variables: human unpredictability, environmental change, chance encounters that could alter the trajectory of his carefully structured life. He respected these variables not as threats but as constraints, invisible lines defining the space within, which he could maneuver safely. The unseen was always the most dangerous. Richard's work had become an interplay of precision and psychology. Killing, once the act that defined him, was now part of a larger system. Each decision was a node in a complex network, with consequences radiating outward quietly, without fanfare. He studied reactions as meticulously as he studied routes and methods. The way fear manifested in the slightest hesitation, the subtle signs of uncertainty, these details were more telling than words. Understanding them provided advantage, reassurance, and paradoxically, a reminder of the limits of control. He also understood the delicate balance between presence and invisibility. Too much visibility drew attention. Too much invisibility allowed variables to accumulate unseen. He maintained equilibrium by careful selection: when to act, when to step back, when to assert control. In this balance, Richard found a rhythm, a quiet order that both stabilized him and gave him a sense of superiority over the less disciplined. His household reflected this philosophy. Control was absolute. Silence was enforced subtly through expectation rather than explicit rules. Obedience was expected, and deviation was observed. The psychological environment mirrored the operational one, structured, predictable, and under his influence. To outsiders, his life appeared normal, even mundane. To him, it was a fortress of control, a carefully maintained ecosystem where variables were monitored, minimized, or eliminated. Yet even the most controlled environments hold anomalies. Unpredictable human emotions, small, fleeting, almost imperceptible, continued to surface. A delayed glance, a whispered question, a hesitation at the wrong time. Each was cataloged mentally, assessed, and used to update his understanding of those around him. His ability to remain vigilant at all times was both a strength and a burden. It provided security, yet required constant engagement. There was no rest, no reprieve, no surrender of attention. Richard's professional life mirrored these principles, amplified. Every assignment required him to integrate logistics, psychology, and contingency planning. Nothing was left to chance. Each action had layers of preparation, escape routes, environmental observation, contingency plans, and backup strategies. He trusted the precision of planning above instinct alone, although instinct remained a critical companion. Decisions were never hurried, execution was deliberate and calm. This precision created a sense of invulnerability, a belief that mistakes were impossible, that exposure was avoidable, that silence could protect completely. Still, he did not allow complacency. Experience had taught him that overconfidence could be fatal. Vigilance was perpetual. Even in moments that seemed safe, his mind evaluated risk. Every variable was considered, cataloged, and addressed. There was no such thing as casual movement. Every action required consideration, anticipation, and readiness. And yet, despite meticulous control, the shadows within persisted. Richard acknowledged them briefly, recognizing their presence as evidence of his humanity. Not weakness, not distraction, but an acknowledgement that even the most disciplined mind carries echoes of consequence. The past, no matter how silenced, remains within. It shapes perception, informs strategy, and subtly reinforces the gravity of every choice. Richard Kuklinski moved through life understanding that mastery was never absolute. Silence was powerful, but it did not erase reality. Discipline was reliable, but it did not remove uncertainty. Isolation provided clarity, yet limited perspective. The shadows within reminded him that even control carries costs, and that the mind, no matter how disciplined, remains a landscape of unseen depth. This internal awareness did not weaken him, it refined him. The acknowledgement of shadows informed every interaction, every decision, every calculation. It reinforced vigilance, strengthened observation, and maintained the delicate balance between control and adaptability. He walked forward with the same calm exterior, but beneath it, the awareness of consequence, risk, and the unseen kept him sharp, methodical, and precise. The shadows within were neither friends nor enemies, they were markers of awareness. They reminded Richard that even a man who believed himself untouchable had limits, that even discipline could not fully suppress consequence, and that even silence carries weight. Navigating these shadows became part of the work itself, as essential as planning, observation, and execution. In this, Richard Kuklinski remained ever vigilant, ever calculating, and ever bound to the duality of his existence. The precise external world he controlled and the persistent internal world he could never fully escape. Richard Kuklinski had long understood that survival in his world required more than strength, skill, or intimidation. It demanded calculation. Every decision, every movement, every interaction meticulously weighed for consequences. By this stage of his life, calculation had become instinctual, but instinct itself was tempered by strategy. It was no longer sufficient to act decisively. One had to anticipate layers of reaction and consequence that often existed beyond immediate perception. Every day began with planning. The simplest tasks were approached with a mindset of optimization. Routes were mapped, times were considered, and interactions evaluated. He did not move without awareness of potential threats, nor did he speak without measuring the impact of words. Richard saw the world as a series of networks, lines of influence and connection, each node representing opportunity or risk. Success depended on navigating these networks with precision. He viewed human behavior analytically. Emotional reactions were not entertaining, they were data. Hesitation, overconfidence, fear, and greed all were observable patterns. Richard cataloged these behaviors silently, building mental profiles that allowed him to predict likely outcomes. The people around him were components in a system, and any deviation from expectation was analyzed immediately. He trusted data over intuition, though intuition remained a secondary check, a fail-safe against error. Control over his immediate environment was absolute. Within his home, within his operational space, everything adhered to structure. Objects were positioned strategically, pathways were clear, and routines were consistent. This consistency was not comfort, it was a security protocol. Repetition reinforced memory, minimized error, and created a rhythm that could be relied upon in high-pressure moments. It was in these rhythms that Richard found calm, the same calm that masked the intensity of his internal calculations. Yet calculation was not static. The criminal world is dynamic and static systems fail. Richard understood that adaptability was as vital as precision. For every plan executed flawlessly, there existed 100 variables that could interfere: unexpected visitors, minor changes in schedule, unforeseen police activity. Anticipating these disruptions required a mental flexibility he maintained through constant observation and scenario planning. Even mundane events were filtered through this lens: a conversation at a store, a glance from a passerby, the timing of a delivery. Every detail contributed to the broader picture of risk management. Preparation extended beyond immediate threats. Richard also planned for the long term. Assets were managed quietly, funds allocated strategically, and relationships nurtured not by trust or friendship, but by function and reliability. He avoided ostentation, understanding that conspicuous wealth draws attention. The appearance of normalcy was a shield, but the underlying structure of his life was anything but ordinary. He operated a complex, layered system invisible to outsiders but internally coherent and consistently reinforced. Decision-making followed rigorous internal rules. Each choice was assessed for potential exposure, consequences, and reversibility. When uncertainty arose, he preferred actions that limited interaction and increased predictability. It was not feared, it was measured, analyzed, and mitigated. For Richard, the absence of error was not a goal, it was a prerequisite. Every operation, every meeting, every conversation had to maintain the integrity of his system. The psychological component of calculation was equally critical. Richard understood that perception is as powerful as reality. People act based on what they believe to be true, often more so than on what is true. By controlling perception, he controlled outcomes indirectly. His calm demeanor, minimal communication, and predictable behavior created an environment in which others felt constrained, cautious, and uncertain. Fear, when subtle and calculated, was more effective than brute force. Even violence, when employed, followed these principles. Richard did not act impulsively. Each act of lethal force was premeditated, executed with methodical precision, and minimized exposure. Killing was not about emotion, it was about outcomes. He considered the consequences on multiple levels: immediate elimination of a problem, long-term effect on networks, perception among peers, and potential law enforcement attention. Each layer of consideration reinforced the controlled nature of his actions. Yet calculation carries hidden weight. Maintaining vigilance, processing data, and anticipating variables required constant mental energy. Richard rarely allowed moments of unstructured thought. When quiet arrived, it was filled with assessment, rehearsal, and refinement. He reviewed interactions, reconsidered potential risks, and adjusted contingencies for future scenarios. Sleep was not relaxation, it was strategic downtime. Even in dreams, the mind often rehearsed escape routes and outcomes, sharpening mental acuity. Despite the intensity of his internal focus, Richard maintained an outward composure that betrayed nothing. To the casual observer, he appeared calm, unremarkable, and reliable. This exterior was deliberate. It masked the extraordinary mental operations occurring within. People misjudged him because his behavior conformed to expected norms. This misjudgment was part of his advantage. He could operate within systems unnoticed precisely because he appeared ordinary. The iterative process of calculation extended to every aspect of life. Meals were timed, interactions brief, movements deliberate. Habits were chosen for efficiency, not comfort. Distractions were minimized, emotional engagement limited. In this highly optimized environment, Richard achieved remarkable operational consistency. Mistakes were rare, deviations noticed immediately, and errors corrected before they could escalate. However, even a perfectly calculated system is vulnerable to unknowns. Despite decades of planning, observation, and discipline, chance remains an uncontrollable factor. The criminal world is inherently unpredictable. Networks shift, allegiances change, and unforeseen events can ripple outward in ways that even meticulous calculation cannot fully anticipate. Richard's mastery mitigated risk but did not eliminate it. Understanding this was a quiet tension he carried, but never allowed to manifest outwardly. In his quiet moments, he sometimes considered the implications of this tension. Not fear. He did not allow fear to influence him, but recognition. Recognition that even the most disciplined man exists within a larger, uncontrollable environment. It was this recognition that drove the perfection of his internal processes. Every decision, every movement, every interaction had to account for both known variables and the possibility of unknown interference. Calculation was not an obsession, it was survival. Richard Kuklinski's life had become a continuous exercise in anticipation. Planning, observation, risk assessment, and execution formed the core of his existence. Every step was deliberate, every action intentional, every outcome considered. Through this lens, he navigated the world with precision, confidence, and a quiet authority born of understanding the interplay of risk, perception, and consequence. He trusted calculation above all else, yet he remained aware that no system, no matter how rigorous, could be entirely invulnerable. This awareness did not weaken him. Instead, it reinforced his discipline. The shadows of uncertainty, the invisible threads of risk, the constant possibility of unforeseen events, all were factors to be integrated into decisions, not feared. Richard's life was a testament to the power of calculation, a man operating in a world of chaos, crafting order through vigilance, observation, and an unyielding commitment to control. Over time, Richard Kuklinski recognized that the true power in his life lay not in strength or intimidation but in isolation. It was not a state imposed by circumstance, it was a deliberate choice, a carefully constructed fortress in which every wall, every door, every passage had been measured and reinforced. Unlike the casual solitude that many men experience, his isolation was absolute, purposeful, and endlessly maintained. Within it he was untouchable, or so he believed. Every decision reinforced this isolation. Interactions were minimal and transactional. Conversations were stripped of embellishment. Words were used sparingly, only when necessary to communicate instructions, obtain information, or maintain appearances. Silence, once a tool, had become an environment, a constant presence that shaped perception, behavior, and response. Those who encountered him in this state often felt tension without understanding why, a subtle pressure that commanded attention and respect without a single raised voice. His home was the perfect extension of this principle. Every room, every corner, every object served a function beyond mere aesthetics. Pathways were clear, exits considered, and access controlled. It was not paranoia, it was logic. Richard understood that control over space equaled control over opportunity. By maintaining dominance over his immediate environment, he minimized risk, optimized efficiency, and created a psychological buffer against uncertainty. But isolation has a paradoxical nature. It protects, yet it amplifies vulnerability in ways that are invisible. The less a person relies on others, the more a single mistake matters. The fewer eyes that observe, the fewer warnings exist. The absence of social checks and balances sharpens judgment but reduces perspective. Richard understood this intellectually, yet he had mastered the art of mental self-reliance to compensate. Every potential oversight was anticipated, preempted, and neutralized before it could become a threat. Even in interactions with trusted individuals, he maintained strict boundaries. Trust was not freely given. It was earned, measured, and conditional. Anyone who entered his inner sphere was evaluated rigorously, their actions scrutinized for alignment with expectations. Deviations, however minor, were noted, cataloged, and often corrected quietly but decisively. Compliance was never assumed, it was observed. Failure to conform was not tolerated. Richard's discipline extended to routine and timing. Daily movements were optimized for safety and efficiency. Routes were varied, schedules calculated, contingencies prepared. Every journey, every transaction, every minor action had layers of consideration designed to prevent exposure. In this way, isolation was not merely physical, it was temporal, strategic, and psychological. He created not just distance from others, but a controlled rhythm in which he could operate with minimal vulnerability. Yet isolation demands self-reliance beyond what most people can imagine. Every failure, every miscalculation, every misstep had consequences that could not be mitigated by others. Responsibility was absolute, pressure constant, and decision-making perpetual. Richard had long accepted this. But the cumulative weight of operating in solitude shaped both his behavior and his perception of the world. He grew less tolerant of errors from anyone, less willing to accept unpredictability, and increasingly reliant on his own judgment, experience, and observation. The psychological aspect of isolation was equally significant. Silence, minimal exposure, and careful management of information created a sense of invulnerability, yet it also intensified his awareness of the stakes. Every choice, no matter how minor, was considered in the context of cumulative risk. Every interaction had the potential to reveal information, expose vulnerability, or trigger unwanted attention. This awareness, while constant, did not create panic. It created clarity. It focused the mind on measurable objectives, observable outcomes, and the disciplined management of variables. Richard's approach to operational security reflected this philosophy. Meetings were brief, planned meticulously, and conducted in controlled environments. Conversations were direct, data-driven, and stripped of unnecessary detail. Observation preceded action. Exit strategies were always prepared, contingencies accounted for, and backup plans layered in case initial measures failed. This methodology extended even to the simplest tasks. Whether moving through a city street, making a delivery, or interacting with casual acquaintances, he operated as if every moment could have consequences beyond immediate perception. This constant focus sharpened his perception. He noticed details that others overlooked, a shadow in the wrong place, a hesitation in a voice, an inconsistency in routine. These observations fed his planning, reinforced his control, and maintained the integrity of his isolation. He trusted patterns over impulse, precision over instinct, and observation over assumption. Mistakes were unacceptable, not because they reflected personal weakness, but because in a tightly controlled system, even a minor error could create cascading consequences. Richard's relationships, or lack thereof, reinforced isolation as both protection and strategy. He allowed no emotional entanglement to compromise judgment. Intimacy, affection, and dependency were liabilities. Distance was not only tactical but psychological, creating a buffer against unpredictability. Fear and respect replaced attachment, reinforcing obedience while minimizing exposure. Those who interacted with him rarely experienced his full attention or trust, and this absence of openness amplified both his control and the perception of invincibility. Despite the rigor of this self-imposed fortress, Richard understood that absolute isolation has limitations. No system is perfect. Unpredictable variables exist: chance encounters, technological surveillance, environmental shifts, human error. He mitigated these risks through constant reassessment, scenario planning, and observation. Isolation, therefore, was not static. It was dynamic, continuously maintained, and constantly reinforced. Richard Kuklinski's isolation was not loneliness. It was a functional environment optimized for control, efficiency, and operational security. It allowed him to move through a world of danger with precision, confidence, and authority. Yet it carried hidden costs. The mental discipline required to sustain this isolation consumed attention, constrained perspective, and amplified responsibility. The fewer people he relied upon, the more absolute his own judgment became. The more controlled his environment, the more critical each choice. Within this fortress, Richard existed in a space of clarity and tension. He was free from the errors and unpredictability of others, yet constantly aware that even the smallest misstep could compromise everything. Isolation protected him, focused him, and elevated his operational capacity. But it also reminded him that freedom exists only as long as control remains intact, and control demands vigilance, calculation, and an unwavering commitment to discipline. In the end, Richard Kuklinski understood that isolation was both a weapon and a shield. It allowed him to act decisively, operate silently, and maintain dominance in a world filled with unpredictability. It created the perception of invincibility. It minimized risk. And within its walls, he found the conditions to survive, succeed, and sustain a life built entirely on precision, observation, and calculated control. Richard Kuklinski had come to see the world as a complex lattice of variables, where chaos and order coexisted in uneasy balance. To navigate it required not only awareness but precision and ability to measure, anticipate, and act with exactness that few could comprehend. He understood instinctually that chaos was inevitable, but he also believed that through disciplined observation and meticulous calculation, one could manage it effectively. Precision was not perfection, it was control applied consistently in an unpredictable environment. Each day was structured as if it were part of a larger operation. Richard's movements were deliberate, timed to minimize exposure and maximize efficiency. He considered every detail, from the angle of approach in a meeting to the sequence of steps required to leave a building undetected. Nothing was left to chance. Even ordinary tasks, making a purchase, navigating a city street, or responding to a phone call, were analyzed for potential risk. These routines created layers of protection, allowing him to maintain control without drawing attention. Observation was central to precision. Richard trained himself to notice minute details that others overlooked. A slight pause in conversation, the shift of weight in a person's stance, the tone of a voice carrying subtle hints all provided valuable information. He recorded these cues mentally, integrating them into his assessment of risk. The mind of a killer, in his view, must function like a sophisticated instrument, capable of processing data, predicting outcomes, and adjusting strategy instantaneously. Trust was a limited commodity. Richard understood that most people were unreliable, motivated by impulse, greed, or fear. Even those who appeared loyal were scrutinized for inconsistencies. Any deviation from expected behavior was noted, analyzed, and factored into future decisions. Relationships were tactical, not emotional. Fear and respect replaced sentiment. Those who crossed his thresholds were either corrected quietly or removed entirely from his operational equation. Yet precision required more than observation and discipline. It required anticipation. Richard constantly projected scenarios in his mind, exploring countless permutations of action and reaction. He asked questions before they were asked, solved problems before they emerged, and constructed contingencies for situations that might never occur. This foresight was not fantasy, it was applied logic, honed over years of practice and experience. In his environment, nothing was random. Even seemingly minor details could produce cascading consequences if ignored. A misjudged conversation, an overlooked sign, a delayed response all could undermine the carefully maintained equilibrium. Richard's attention to these details ensured that risk remained minimized and that control persisted. Precision was not an abstract ideal, it was the foundation of his survival. His operations, particularly those involving violence, exemplified this approach. Every act was planned with surgical accuracy. The timing of movements, the selection of tools, the assessment of environment, and the monitoring of witnesses were all carefully considered. The execution was calm and methodical, with each step designed to reduce exposure and prevent error. Emotions were excluded from the process. Fear, anger, or excitement had no place in decisions that demanded clarity and precision. Richard's perception of the world extended beyond immediate threats. He studied patterns, anticipating how others might act, how environments might change, and how law enforcement methods might evolve. This strategic mindset allowed him to operate within a chaotic world while maintaining the illusion of order. He believed that understanding the broader picture was essential, yet he never allowed it to interfere with the meticulous management of immediate variables. Isolation played a key role in sustaining precision. By limiting interactions, he reduced the number of unpredictable elements influencing his decisions. Silence became both a shield and a tool, creating distance between himself and potential sources of error. Within this controlled environment, his thoughts remained clear, his judgment sharp, and his execution uncompromised. The discipline required to maintain such isolation was immense, yet Richard bore it effortlessly, having long internalized its necessity. Yet precision comes at a psychological cost. Constant vigilance, mental calculation, and relentless planning create tension that is invisible to the outside observer. Even when relaxed outwardly, the mind is engaged continuously. Richard rarely allowed moments of unguarded thought. Every decision, every action, and every observation demanded scrutiny. Mistakes, he understood, were magnified by isolation. There was no one to share responsibility and no margin for error. Despite these pressures, Richard maintained composure. His calm exterior was both practical and strategic. Those who observed him saw stability, reliability, and authority. Few recognized the intensity of thought operating beneath the surface. This perception of control reinforced his power, allowing him to influence, manipulate, and dominate situations without overt confrontation. Richard also understood that precision extended to communication. Words were selected carefully, delivered without ambiguity, and used sparingly. He avoided unnecessary dialogue, knowing that excessive speech introduces risk. Even in brief conversations, he gauged reactions, recorded nuances, and adjusted future interactions accordingly. Every word, like every action, carried weight and consequence. This level of precision allowed Richard to operate in an environment where chaos was constant. It provided predictability in unpredictable situations and stability where instability threatened to emerge. It reinforced his perception of invulnerability while simultaneously demanding relentless discipline. He trusted his system, his routines, and his calculations because they had proven effective repeatedly, yet he remained aware that even the most carefully managed variables could fail. Richard Kuklinski's life was an exercise in managing uncertainty with exactness. Precision governed movement, communication, observation, and execution. It transformed isolation into protection, control into power, and silence into a strategic instrument. In a world defined by unpredictability, it was precision that allowed him to act decisively, survive threats, and maintain dominance. The illusion of invincibility he knew was fragile, yet by applying relentless calculation and absolute attention to detail, he maintained the appearance of certainty while navigating the chaos of his world with surgical clarity. Every step was deliberate, every decision intentional, and every outcome controlled to the maximum extent possible. Precision in Richard's life was not a choice, it was survival. Richard Kuklinski's life was a study in the relentless pursuit of control, and by now he had refined the concept of the calculated edge, the ability to act decisively in any situation while maintaining the utmost discretion. Every movement, every interaction, and every decision was informed by the principle that risk could be anticipated, mitigated, and controlled. To outsiders, his life appeared ordinary, almost methodical, yet underneath that veneer lay a mind constantly engaged in analysis, prediction, and strategic planning. He understood that every situation carried multiple potential outcomes, some obvious, others hidden. Success required recognizing the hidden consequences before they manifested. This meant observing patterns in human behavior, evaluating environments with precision, and predicting the ripple effects of each action. It was not enough to simply react. One had to foresee and preempt. In this, Richard had cultivated an almost supernatural awareness of how the world operated, especially in contexts where stakes were high and margins for error were negligible. Richard's mornings, the routine, were anything but casual. Each step was deliberate. Movements were timed and measured. His environment was scanned continuously for anomalies, a misplaced object, a delayed delivery, a subtle change in a person's behavior. Every observation contributed to his understanding of the operational landscape. It was a life of vigilance, but one practiced so thoroughly that it appeared effortless. Outsiders saw calm, but inside his mind was always mapping scenarios, evaluating variables, and calculating contingencies. This constant evaluation extended to human relationships. Trust was scarce, loyalty conditional. Richard observed how individuals interacted, how they responded to authority, fear, or opportunity. Small details in inconsistent story, a hesitation in speech, a fleeting gesture were cataloged mentally. They were signals, pieces of a puzzle that allowed him to anticipate behavior. Those who aligned with his expectations were valuable. Those who did not were either adjusted, removed, or ignored entirely. There was no emotional attachment to these decisions. Emotion in Richard's philosophy introduced vulnerability. Precision required detachment. The calculated edge was also about timing. Acting too early could create unnecessary exposure. Acting too late could result in loss of control. Richard measured timing with exactness, using routines and rehearsed patterns to create predictability in an unpredictable world. He developed contingency plans for contingencies themselves, layering safety nets that most people would never consider necessary. This obsessive attention to timing ensured that when he acted, the result was nearly always favorable, and the chance of error minimal. Even in tasks that seemed mundane, Richard applied this principle. Driving through a city, making purchases, or scheduling meetings were all opportunities to practice precision. Routes were chosen to minimize visibility and risk. Encounters were anticipated. Every action had a secondary purpose, maintaining security, gathering information, or reinforcing perception. Nothing was incidental. Nothing was without purpose. The mind of a man living at the calculated edge perceives everything as part of the operational landscape. Isolation, once a fortress, was now an instrument. By controlling access to himself and his environment, Richard reduced unpredictability. This isolation allowed him to focus, observe, and plan without interference. Yet he understood that isolation carried its own dangers, limited feedback, concentrated responsibility, and the constant need for self-monitoring. Every decision carried disproportionate weight, and every miscalculation could have cascading consequences. But Richard thrived under this pressure, using it to sharpen judgment and reinforce discipline. Precision and observation were supplemented by adaptability. While routines and patterns were essential, rigidity could be fatal. Richard balanced structured behavior with the ability to adjust instantly. If a variable changed, a person acted unexpectedly, a schedule shifted. An environment altered, he responded with controlled improvisation. Adaptability was not chaotic. It was disciplined, practiced, and integrated into his system. It allowed him to maintain the edge even when circumstances deviated from expectation. The psychological dimension of this calculated edge was subtle but profound. Richard cultivated an aura of inevitability. People sensed that he anticipated outcomes they could not. His calm, measured demeanor communicated confidence and authority. Those who crossed him often did so hesitantly, unsure if resistance was possible. Fear, controlled and deliberate, reinforced his operational advantage. It was not the fear of violence alone, but the fear of unpredictability, the awareness that Richard was always several steps ahead, even when executing acts of lethal consequence. The principle of the calculated edge was maintained. Every operation was planned, rehearsed mentally, and executed with meticulous care. Variables were considered at every level: environment, timing, method, witnesses, and escape routes. Emotions were excluded. Decisions were based on logic, observation, and anticipated outcomes. The result was efficiency, invisibility, and sustained control. Richard's understanding of information was another critical aspect of his edge. He recognized that knowledge, properly applied, is power. Every conversation, every interaction, every observation contributed to a mental database he constantly updated. He filtered information ruthlessly, discarding the irrelevant while retaining actionable intelligence. This ability to synthesize data allowed him to maintain situational awareness far beyond the ordinary, reinforcing the perception of omnipotence. Even with all this, Richard understood that no edge is permanent. The world is dynamic, and variables exist beyond prediction. Luck, chance, and human error could never be entirely eliminated. But by combining observation, calculation, adaptability, and precision, he minimized risk and maximized control. The calculated edge, therefore, was not a guarantee of invincibility. It was a methodology, a disciplined approach to navigating uncertainty with maximum efficiency and minimum exposure. Richard Kuklinski's life, lived on the calculated edge, was a continuous balancing act between control and unpredictability. It required constant attention, unwavering discipline, and a mind capable of processing complexity in real time. It created the illusion of invulnerability while demanding vigilance, precision, and adaptability. Within this framework, he could operate decisively, act silently, and sustain dominance in a world where chaos was always lurking. The calculated edge was more than survival, it was mastery. It allowed him to move through danger undetected, to anticipate actions before they occurred, and to maintain authority without overt confrontation. Every step, every movement, every interaction was informed by this principle. It defined his existence, shaped his perception, and guided his choices. Richard Kuklinski lived not by impulse, chance, or emotion, but by the relentless discipline of calculation, the clarity of observation, and the precision of execution. It was the edge that kept him ahead of a world defined by unpredictability. And it was the edge that made him the silent force feared and respected by all who encountered him. Richard Kuklinski had long mastered the art of existing between extremes, between visibility and invisibility, between action and restraint, between life as ordinary and life as extraordinary. His existence was defined not by what was seen, but by what was controlled, measured, and anticipated. He navigated the world with a precision few could comprehend, sustained by an internal discipline so rigid that chaos seemed foreign, almost irrelevant. Yet beneath this facade he moved in the shadows, understanding that silence was both ally and weapon. The day-to-day reality of his life required constant attention. Every interaction was evaluated for potential exposure, every routine examined for hidden risk, and every environment mapped for opportunities and threats. He moved with deliberate care, aware that even minor deviations from plan could create cascading consequences. Nothing was coincidental. Everything had purpose. Even seemingly ordinary moments waiting for a train, making a purchase, or walking along a city street were observed, analyzed, and integrated into a mental model of operational awareness. Richard's mastery over the human element was central to his control. He understood that fear, respect, and perception could influence behavior more effectively than brute force. Silence in particular was a powerful tool. By limiting speech, avoiding unnecessary explanation, and maintaining emotional neutrality, he shaped the behavior of those around him. People responded to the unknown, they respected what they could not fully grasp. In cultivating this perception, he amplified his control, while minimizing direct confrontation. Observation was relentless. Richard noted the subtlest cues, a glance that lingered too long, a shift in posture, the hesitation before words were spoken. These signals were analyzed instantly, their potential implications integrated into his understanding of the environment. He cataloged behavior patterns meticulously, building predictive models in real time. Mistakes by others were opportunities, distractions were anomalies to account for, and every variation became data that reinforced his situational advantage. Isolation was both protection and strategy. By controlling access to himself and limiting exposure to the unpredictable, he minimized risk. This isolation was maintained physically, psychologically, and socially. Those who approached him were either vetted, observed, or subtly discouraged. Emotional entanglements were avoided as they introduced variables he could not fully manage. Even within his home, control extended to timing, movement, and communication. Every detail was purposeful, reinforcing a consistent environment in which he could operate without distraction. Yet living in this constant state of vigilance was demanding. The mind could not rest, and every choice carried weight. Richard rarely allowed unstructured thought. Silence was not relaxation, it was observation and rehearsal. His internal monologue continuously processed scenarios, evaluated potential outcomes, and rehearsed responses to situations that might never occur. This constant engagement honed mental acuity but also ensured that fatigue, error, and complacency were minimized. Richard's approach to risk was methodical. He did not act recklessly, he acted decisively. Every action was measured for consequences across multiple layers: immediate impact, ripple effects on networks, potential exposure, and long-term ramifications. Even acts of extreme violence were executed with calm precision, minimizing unpredictability. Execution was disciplined, unemotional, and deliberate, reflecting a mindset that prioritized outcome over impulse. In a world where perception often outweighs reality, Richard cultivated a presence that commanded authority without aggression. Calmness was his armor, observation was his weapon. People instinctively recognized his competence, but few understood the depth of calculation beneath it. The impression of inevitability reinforced his dominance, shaping the behavior of associates, adversaries, and witnesses alike. Fear became a tool, but one wielded subtly, without the spectacle of overt violence. His routines were both protective and strategic. Routes were chosen for discretion, schedules for efficiency, and meetings for controlled communication. Even mundane tasks, paying bills, traveling, or socializing, were executed with purpose. Environmental assessment was constant. Escape routes were always considered. Contingencies existed for contingencies. This layered approach ensured that risk remained manageable while reinforcing his operational edge. Psychological awareness was critical. Richard understood that control over others is as much about perception as about action. By shaping what others saw, knew, and expected, he controlled behavior indirectly. Silence created uncertainty. Predictability in behavior projected strength. Observation reinforced understanding. Through these methods, he navigated a world filled with unpredictability, while minimizing exposure to danger. Yet even mastery carries subtle pressures. The weight of responsibility, the need for constant vigilance, and the burden of calculation are never absent. Mistakes once made are irreversible in a life like Richard's. Every action is consequential, every oversight magnified. Even with decades of experience, he remained aware that complete control was an illusion. Only disciplined mitigation could approach it. Adaptability complemented his precision. While routines and planning were critical, Richard could adjust instantly when variables changed. Unexpected encounters, environmental shifts, or behavioral anomalies were incorporated into immediate decisions. Adaptation was practiced, deliberate, and integrated into his operational method. It allowed him to sustain dominance without rigidly relying on assumptions or static routines. The shadows he navigated were both literal and figurative. Richard moved through spaces unnoticed, operating where others did not perceive danger. But he also operated in the abstract shadows of consequence, influence, and perception. Every action had reverberations beyond immediate awareness, shaping networks, relationships, and potential threats. The life of a man living between shadows and silence is one where calculation is continuous, consequences are measured, and visibility is controlled. Richard Kuklinski existed in a state where silence was power, observation was control, and precision was survival. He moved with awareness of the fragility of life, the unpredictability of human behavior, and the persistent threat of exposure. Yet he carried himself with calm authority, allowing perception to reinforce his power, while minimizing risk. In this space, between shadows and silence, he navigated danger with unmatched skill, sustained control through disciplined observation, and maintained dominance in a world defined by unpredictability. Even as the world shifted and variables evolved, Richard remained anchored by his principles: isolation, observation, precision, and adaptability. Silence was not absence, it was methodology. Shadows were not threats, they were terrain. Life itself was measured, calculated, and navigated with the constant awareness that every choice mattered. Through this discipline he continued to survive, to act decisively, and to maintain the balance between control and chaos that defined his existence. Richard Kuklinski understood that survival in his world was defined not by luck or opportunity, but by necessity, cold, calculated necessity. Every choice he made, every action he undertook was governed by the unyielding principle that mistakes could not be tolerated and hesitation could not exist. Necessity dictated behavior, and within this framework, Richard developed a mastery of precision and foresight unmatched by most. Each day, the routines that might have seemed mundane to outsiders were carefully orchestrated operations in miniature. From the timing of leaving his home to the routes he chose in public, every movement had purpose. Even the smallest details, how he entered a room, the angle of his gaze, the cadence of his speech, were evaluated for their potential impact. Nothing was left to chance. The environment was a complex system of risks and opportunities, and he navigated it with the care of a man threading a needle while blindfolded. Observation was both defensive and strategic. Richard noted everything: the brief hesitation in a stranger's step, the nervous glance exchanged between co-workers, the subtle inconsistencies in routine. These small indicators were data points, evidence of potential risk or opportunity. He cataloged them silently, building mental models of behavior and predicting outcomes long before anyone else perceived them. Every decision was informed by this analysis, creating a rhythm in which he could operate with near-perfect anticipation. Trust, in Richard's world, was conditional. Few were allowed access to the inner workings of his life, and even those who had proximity were carefully monitored. He understood that loyalty could falter, that emotion could cloud judgment, and that human error could undermine even the most meticulously planned operations. Those who deviated from expectation were corrected, isolated, or eliminated quietly, with minimal disruption. In his universe, trust was measured in actions, not words, and every individual's utility was evaluated objectively. Isolation, once a protective measure, had become a strategic instrument. By controlling access to himself, Richard minimized exposure and maximized clarity of thought. Within the controlled environment of his home and operational space, he could focus entirely on observation, analysis, and preparation. Silence was more than comfort, it was methodology. It allowed him to anticipate, to predict, and to act with precision, free from the distractions and unpredictability introduced by unnecessary interaction. Yet even with this disciplined isolation, Richard never allowed himself complacency. He knew that no environment is perfectly controlled, no system perfectly insulated from the unpredictable. Variables existed beyond the scope of planning: unexpected encounters, environmental changes, technological interventions, human error. He mitigated these risks with careful contingency planning, integrating flexibility into otherwise rigid routines. Adaptation was as essential as precision, allowing him to respond effectively when the world deviated from expectation. The acts that defined Richard's reputation, the killings, the enforcement, the intimidation, were executed under the same principles. Every operation was planned meticulously. Timing, method, environment, observation of witnesses, and escape routes were all considered in advance. Execution was calm, methodical, and devoid of emotion. Decisions were based on logic, probability, and anticipated outcomes rather than impulse or sentiment. This cold adherence to necessity ensured efficiency and minimized exposure, making him virtually untouchable within his operational domain. Richard's psychological acuity was as sharp as his operational skill. He understood that fear, perception, and anticipation often outweighed physical power. By projecting calm, maintaining silence, and observing subtle cues, he influenced behavior without overt confrontation. People around him were aware of his competence, but few understood the depth of calculation that governed his actions. Fear became a subtle, pervasive instrument of control, applied without spectacle or dramatics. Those who encountered him experienced influence without direct force, a hallmark of his calculated mastery. Every interaction, no matter how brief, contributed to his mental mapping of risk. Conversations were stripped of unnecessary detail, words chosen deliberately, reactions analyzed instantly. Each encounter added to a mental database used to anticipate behavior, forecast consequences, and guide decisions. Even seemingly trivial information, tone of voice, posture, choice of words was significant. In a life dictated by necessity, no detail was irrelevant, no observation wasted. The precision required to operate under this principle was immense. Richard was constantly aware that a single miscalculation could have cascading consequences. Isolation magnified responsibility, placing the burden of every choice entirely on him. There was no margin for error, no room for compromise. Vigilance was perpetual, mental engagement constant, and preparation unending. Fatigue, complacency, or oversight were luxuries he could not afford. Richard's relationship with time reflected this necessity. Moments were precious, each second a potential point of leverage or risk. Actions were executed with exactness, leaving nothing to chance. Scheduling was strategic, movement controlled, and contingency planning continuous. Even in routine tasks, he applied the same discipline, ensuring that every step reinforced security, efficiency, and control. Time in his world was both a tool and a constraint, and mastery over it was essential. Even with meticulous planning, Richard acknowledged the limits of control. Unforeseen variables existed everywhere: chance encounters, unpredictable behavior, environmental shifts. Yet he did not fear these unknowns. Instead, he incorporated adaptability into his strategy. Flexibility was part of precision. He could deviate instantly from routine when circumstances demanded, while maintaining the overall integrity of his operational framework. This balance of rigidity and adaptability was what made him effective, almost invulnerable, and constantly a step ahead of those around him. Richard Kuklinski's life was a continuous exercise in balancing necessity with control. He lived in a world defined by uncertainty, yet moved through it with a level of calculation that created the perception of inevitability. Silence, observation, precision, and adaptability were the instruments of his survival. Fear and respect were byproducts of his methodology, and influence flowed from his ability to act decisively while remaining enigmatic. Within this structure, Richard existed between extremes. He was neither reckless nor emotionally driven. He was not visible, yet always present. He did not seek recognition, yet his reputation preceded him. Necessity dictated his actions, but within it, he created freedom. The freedom to act without hesitation, the freedom to control outcomes, and the freedom to sustain a life defined by order in a world governed by chaos. Living at the intersection of shadows and calculation, Richard Kuklinski maintained dominance not through force alone, but through the cold, unyielding application of necessity. Every movement, every observation, every choice was informed by a relentless pursuit of control and precision. He existed in a space where chaos could never reach him, where preparation was armor, and where silence was both shield and weapon. In this world, he remained untouchable, decisive, and always, undeniably, in command. Richard Kuklinski had perfected the delicate balance between action and invisibility, a mastery that made him both feared and elusive. His world was one of constant tension, a place where every interaction, every observation, and every movement mattered. To outsiders, he appeared calm, methodical, almost mundane, but beneath this calm flowed a mind, tuned to constant vigilance, calculation, and anticipation. Silence and shadows were not just his allies, they were the foundation of his dominance. Every moment of his day was approached with intention. Richard moved through life as though the world itself were a chessboard, each person a piece whose potential was evaluated continuously. Paths were chosen not merely for convenience, but for control, with awareness of who might be watching, what might change, and which variables could introduce risk. Even routine actions, entering a store, walking along a street, or conversing with strangers, were exercises in assessment, planning, and subtle observation. The world was full of information, and he absorbed it all, filtering it for actionable insight. Observation was the core of his strategy. Richard noticed patterns, deviations, and hidden signals that others overlooked. A slight hesitation in speech, a glance held too long, or a shift in posture could indicate intent, fear, or opportunity. These cues were cataloged mentally, and each informed future decisions. He trusted evidence over assumption, logic over emotion. Human behavior was predictable to him in ways that few could understand, and he leveraged this to maintain control while remaining unseen. Isolation reinforced his mastery. Richard limited exposure not out of fear, but as a deliberate method to reduce unpredictability. Few were allowed close access, and those who were remained under constant observation. Emotional entanglement was dangerous, a variable too difficult to control, and thus rarely permitted. Silence became both shield and instrument, allowing him to maintain clarity of thought while manipulating the environment with minimal effort. This level of discipline extended into every aspect of daily life. Timing was critical. Every action, from leaving a location to engaging in conversation, was measured against potential consequences. Contingencies were prepared for even the most minor events. Adaptability was as important as structure. When unforeseen circumstances arose, he adjusted instantly, integrating new variables without disrupting the overall strategy. This dynamic balance of precision and flexibility defined his operational capability. Fear, carefully cultivated and subtly applied, reinforced his power. Richard understood that perception often outweighs reality. By controlling what others saw, what they suspected, and what they could anticipate, he influenced behavior indirectly. His calm demeanor and minimal verbal communication created an air of inevitability, making those around him uncertain and hesitant. This psychological advantage allowed him to exert control without confrontation, relying on the invisible tension of unspoken authority. Every act of violence, when required, was executed with the same methodology. Precision, timing, observation, and discretion were always paramount. Richard did not act out of emotion, revenge, or impulse. He acted because circumstances demanded it, and because the calculated outcome required it. Each operation was premeditated to minimize exposure, maximize control, and maintain operational integrity. The act itself was almost invisible to those who might later investigate, a testament to his mastery of discretion. Even routine communication was an extension of this mastery. Words were chosen sparingly and strategically, always assessed for potential consequences. Conversations were tools for observation, testing responses, gathering information, or reinforcing perception. Each interaction was both a probe and a rehearsal, revealing hidden dynamics while advancing strategic awareness. Silence was equally potent, leaving others uncertain, cautious, and obedient to his unspoken authority. Richard's awareness extended beyond immediate threats. He understood patterns of influence, the shifting allegiances within criminal networks, and the subtle interplay of power among peers and adversaries. Information was weaponized subtly. Knowledge applied strategically allowed him to anticipate conflicts, prevent exposure, and manipulate outcomes before action was required. This systemic thinking transformed chaos into opportunity, unpredictability into a manageable variable. Isolation, precision, observation, and adaptability were reinforced by ritualized control over his environment. Richard's living spaces, his routes, and even his interactions were structured to reduce randomness. Objects were positioned intentionally, movements rehearsed, and timing coordinated. Even small, seemingly irrelevant details were considered for their potential impact. This level of control minimized surprises and allowed him to operate at a level of efficiency rarely observed. The psychological aspect of his mastery cannot be overstated. Richard understood that control over others often comes from perception. People fear what they do not fully understand. He cultivated an aura of certainty and inevitability while remaining largely invisible. His calm, measured movements, minimal speech, and deliberate gestures created tension without overthreat. Individuals instinctively deferred, adjusted behavior, or hesitated in ways that reinforced his dominance. Fear and respect became byproducts of calculated influence, not tools of intimidation alone. Even in moments of extreme tension, Richard maintained composure. Internal vigilance never ceased, but outwardly, he appeared unflappable. This duality, calm exterior, constantly calculating mind, made him a uniquely effective operator. Situations that might cause panic, hesitation, or overreaction in others were approached with clarity, assessment, and controlled execution. Mistakes were minimized not by luck, but by relentless preparation, observation, and the integration of every variable into a cohesive mental framework. Living between shadows and silence, Richard operated in a constant state of awareness. He was attuned to the smallest deviations, the subtlest changes, and the faintest indicators of risk or opportunity. The world itself became a canvas on which he could act decisively, shaping outcomes invisibly. Control was both strategic and psychological. The perception of inevitability ensured compliance, while his actions enforced it. Even as environments changed, threats emerged, and alliances shifted, Richard remained adaptable. Precision and vigilance were constant. Strategy was dynamic. He could alter routines instantly, shift behavior fluidly, and respond to unforeseen variables with minimal disruption. This capacity allowed him to sustain dominance, navigate danger, and maintain operational superiority in a world defined by unpredictability. Richard Kuklinski's mastery of silence and shadows was the culmination of decades of observation, calculation, and discipline. Isolation was transformed into a tactical advantage, vigilance into predictive capability, and perception into control. He moved through life with the confidence of a man who understood both the fragility of circumstance and the power of preparation. Fear, respect, and authority were natural consequences of this mastery. His existence was a testament to the power of disciplined observation, calculated action, and the relentless application of strategy in a world dominated by unpredictability. In this life of shadows, Richard was untouchable. Every step was measured, every decision intentional, every interaction strategic. Silence protected, observation informed, and action executed precisely. He existed as both a figure of inevitability and a shadow moving unseen forever, navigating the intersection of control, risk, and survival with unmatched mastery. Richard Kuklinski moved through the world as a man defined by extremes: silence and action, observation and execution, invisibility and control. Every decision, every movement, and every thought was governed by a single principle: survival through precision and calculated restraint. Life, in its unpredictable complexity, demanded constant awareness, and Richard had long mastered the ability to anticipate, plan, and act with a calm efficiency that few could comprehend. The final years of his operational life were no different in intensity. He continued to operate in a state of perpetual vigilance, aware that even minor lapses could have significant consequences. His routines were deliberate, his routes measured, and every environmental variable assessed meticulously. Even mundane actions, crossing a street, entering a building, or conversing with an acquaintance, were approached with silent calculation, each movement designed to minimize risk and maximize control. Richard's reputation as the Iceman had been cemented not by flamboyance or reckless display, but by the mastery of discipline, foresight, and precision. Violence, when necessary, was executed surgically and without hesitation. The acts themselves were devoid of drama. They were problems to be solved efficiently. Each operation was planned with layered contingencies, every exit route considered, every potential witness observed and accounted for. He relied on meticulous preparation and quiet execution, not impulse, to maintain dominance in a world of uncertainty. Isolation, which had once been a tool for personal protection, became an extension of his operational philosophy. By limiting exposure, he minimized variables that could threaten control. Those who entered his personal or professional space were carefully evaluated, their behavior observed for consistency and reliability. Emotional entanglements were avoided, as attachment could compromise judgment. In this environment, silence was both shield and strategy, allowing Richard to act decisively while remaining largely invisible. Observation was constant. He noted the subtlest cues in human behavior: hesitation in speech, subtle shifts in posture, unspoken reactions. Each of these signals was recorded mentally, analyzed, and incorporated into predictions of future actions. Richard's perception of the world was almost preternatural. He recognized patterns and inconsistencies that would escape ordinary attention. These observations informed decisions at every level, from minor daily choices to matters of life and death. Even his communication was a tool. Words were carefully chosen, precise, and limited to necessary exchanges. Conversations were evaluated for hidden information, behavioral indicators, and strategic implications. Silence conversely amplified authority and influence, leaving others uncertain, cautious, and ultimately compliant. Through this combination of speech and silence, Richard could manipulate situations and people with subtlety, never needing to rely on overt intimidation unless it was operationally necessary. Adaptability remained central to his effectiveness. While structure and planning were critical, rigidity could be fatal. Richard could adjust instantly to unanticipated circumstances, altering his approach while maintaining overall operational integrity. Unexpected developments were integrated seamlessly into his strategies, reinforcing his capacity to maintain control under the most dynamic conditions. This balance of structure and flexibility was a hallmark of his efficiency, allowing him to navigate chaos while preserving precision. His mastery extended beyond immediate operational concerns to understanding the psychological dynamics of power. Richard recognized that influence is most potent when it is perceived rather than demonstrated. Calm, deliberate composure created an aura of inevitability. Silence generated uncertainty. Observation and insight allowed him to anticipate reactions and guide behavior without confrontation. In this, his power was both invisible and absolute, sustained by perception as much as by action. The life Richard led was one of constant calculation. Even leisure, travel, and casual interactions were evaluated for risk and opportunity. He moved through public spaces with awareness of potential threats, leveraging unpredictability while maintaining operational advantage. Every variable was considered, every decision weighted. This disciplined approach created a life of controlled efficiency, where chaos existed only in the minds of those unaware of his methods. Violence remained a tool of last resort, but was executed with the same precision that governed all aspects of his life. Timing, method, environment, and observation were meticulously planned. Each act served a clear objective, leaving minimal evidence and maximizing effect. Emotion played no part. Decisions were based on analysis and necessity. Even lethal acts were almost mechanical in execution, reflective of a mindset in which logic, strategy, and consequence outweighed impulse. In these final years, Richard reflected on the principles that had sustained him: discipline, observation, isolation, precision, and adaptability. These principles were not abstract ideals, they were operational imperatives. They allowed him to survive, dominate, and maintain influence in an environment defined by unpredictability and risk. Silence was not merely absence of sound, it was strategy. Shadows were not empty space, they were terrain to navigate with control. Even as external circumstances shifted, Richard's methods remained consistent. Preparation, calculation, and anticipation continued to define his existence. Opportunities and threats were identified and evaluated with the same relentless attention to detail he had always applied. He trusted his instincts because they were honed by decades of disciplined observation and reinforced by empirical validation. His operational advantage was maintained through an unbroken commitment to methodology, strategy, and precision. Richard Kuklinski's legacy was not built on notoriety or sensationalism. It was built on the quiet application of intelligence, the disciplined use of observation, and the strategic mastery of control. He moved through life unseen yet influential, silent yet decisive. Fear and respect were byproducts of methodology, not performance. He existed in the space between perception and reality, manipulating both with unmatched skill. The life he had led demonstrated that survival in a world of chaos is not a matter of chance, but of deliberate calculation. Every moment, every observation, every decision reinforced control and minimized risk. The integration of isolation, vigilance, precision, adaptability, and psychological insight created a framework within which Richard could operate decisively, maintain dominance, and navigate danger with unparalleled skill. In the end, Richard's existence between silence and shadows defined both his identity and his legacy. He demonstrated that mastery comes not from brute force alone, but from disciplined observation, controlled action, and the intelligent application of strategy. He moved through danger with quiet inevitability, maintaining dominance while remaining largely unseen. Survival, influence, and control were not granted, they were earned through relentless discipline, foresight, and methodical execution. Richard Kuklinski, known to some as the Iceman, lived a life governed by the principles of calculation, precision, and control, a life in which silence was a weapon, shadows were terrain, and mastery was measured not by notoriety but by effectiveness. His actions, decisions, and reputation were shaped by decades of methodical observation, ruthless discipline, and strategic execution. He remained untouchable, decisive, and commanding, a figure whose presence was felt even when he was unseen, whose influence extended through fear, respect, and the quiet certainty of inevitability. In the final analysis, Richard Kuklinski's story is a testament to the power of discipline, observation, and calculated action. It is a narrative of survival and dominance, achieved not through chaos or bravado, but through quiet mastery, relentless vigilance, and the unyielding application of strategy. Silence and shadows were not limitations, they were instruments of control, and in their mastery, Richard Kuklinski secured his place as a figure both feared and enigmatic, a man whose life demonstrates that in a world governed by unpredictability, control, and precision are the ultimate tools of power.